Hello everyone, I'm Tunku. I'll be chair for this round and trainee for this round will be Marvin. Without any further ado, let's have it from OG. Yeah.
We find it very absurd that in 2018, we still have so many terminal illnesses popping up that are new, and we find it very absurd that old terminal illnesses are taking such a long time to be cured, and for people to finally have access to a cure to these terminal illnesses that is both affordable and easily accessible. We find that the biggest issue as to why what makes the process of finding these cures such a lengthy process is because people are generally unwilling to opt in to volunteer to act as experimental subjects to find cures to these diseases. And we find that to be a problem because what people don't understand is the long-term value in agreeing to be experimented on because of these, in the case of these illnesses. And the problem is way too many lives are being lost in the process. Now, the reason why we decided to focus on countries where healthcare is freely accessible is because we're generally talking about countries that are somewhat well off. We're talking about countries like Canada. We're talking about some European countries where a certain standard of healthcare already exists. Why? Because quality is ensured. And how exactly is it ensured? It's ensured because, one, because they have high taxes, which means that they can afford to have a proper and well-regulated environment for these experiments to occur. And the second reason is because when these hospitals or when these agencies are involved in particular, what happens is because there's a lot of media attention, it's a lot more likely that these hospitals are going to be a lot more careful with how they deal with the experiments and make sure that there's a proper amount of quality control and making sure that that the patients go through the least amount of pain that they can go through within this whole process. And another thing that we think is very important, that in case any hospital decides to abuse the power to experiment on these patients, we think that because we're giving them because we're making it mandatory, it's a lot easier for the families to hold these hospitals directly accountable. And that's a check and balance system that our side offers, right? So what exactly is the alternative and what is the problem in the status quo? Later on, what exactly is the problem in the status quo? The problem in the status quo is that not enough people opt into these clinical trials, and that's extremely problematic because it makes the entire process of finding the cures an extremely lengthy one, and way too many lives are being lost in the process. Why? And because of this, these clinical trials and experimentations are going into pharmaceutical companies who have far less ethics in comparison to these hospitals, and that is very problematic. Why? Because the way that they conduct these experiments are extremely unethical. Later on, what they basically do is they send out a circular for people who want to opt into these clinical trials and experiments, and people who are generally very poor are in very dire need of quick money, people who are homeless, people who just need the money right now are the ones who opt in. And that is when these pharmaceutical companies induce these diseases in these people and then attempt to solve them. We think that that's an issue because these are fully functional, proper human beings with their entire lives in front of them. And these people are the ones who are throwing their lives away for some quick cash. And these people are the ones who are being experimented on. And these people are the ones who, in case the experiment or the clinical trial goes badly, might lose their lives. And they're not supposed to in the first place. Right? And another issue that we face in the current state is that because these are pharmaceutical companies and not government hospitals or like hospitals in general, they tend to withhold information. For example, they have their own clinical trial or an experiment, and then they decide to like not disclose this information to other companies who are like trying to further this experiment, and that's extremely problematic because this also slows down the entire process and more lives are lost in the process. Before I move on.
If these clinical trials are so harmless, why not we just change the model and just force normal people to do it? Why does it have to be terminal illnesses, or do you think a DPM will just do that instead?
But I never said that they're harmless. I said that there's a certain risk involved, which is exactly why we're focusing on especially terminally ill patients. And I'm getting to that as to why we're choosing specifically terminally ill patients, right? That's where the philosophy of this debate comes in. We think that because of the fact that these people are already terminally ill, that the utility of their lives are nearing the end of it. Like how much longer are they possibly going to live? Like maybe a few years, and that's all the time that they have left. And we think that that's problematic because because they already know that they have a terminal illness and they don't have a long time to live, they're less likely to be more productive and contribute more to society, which makes them more suitable patients for these clinical trials to be held on. But we also think that because of the fact that these lives are already at the end of their string, that when you decide to hold these clinical trials or experiments on these people, we think that even if in the worst case scenario something goes extremely badly, we think that it's more utilitarian to have these trials on these people as opposed to people who are completely healthy, as opposed to these homeless people who are being currently experimented on in the current status quo. Yes.
We know for sure that it is extremely speculative to find a cure for very niche diseases, hence the policy. But why does it have to come at the direct trade-off instantly of people's life or put in harm right now?
You have to understand that these are not niche diseases. We would probably not want to have research for niche diseases in a facility such as this, in a facility that's such a large-scale thing as this. One. And two, we think that... Wait, I forgot what your question was. Moving on. Because these patients being terminally ill, it's a lot better for us to experiment and like hold these clinical trials on these people in particular, because at the end of the day, in case something really bad goes on, there's still less harm done to the overall net system because they don't have a lot to offer that we know of. Because even if they had a lot to offer, they don't have a lot of time for it to fully fledge. And the lives that we saved in the process, in the longer run, hold a lot more value than the lives that we would save by not having this motion pass. Thank you.
And then,
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. Let's continue with the demonstrations.
The characterization that OG gave us is that there's this shortage of people to experiment on. And we challenge this characterization and we tell you that there isn't this need of the policy because there isn't a shortage of people to experiment on. So my speech will be firstly about what the reasons why there isn't this shortage, and secondly why it is bad for the state to intervene and how it actually like hurts the principle of having your bodily autonomy, and thirdly how it establishes a precedent so that like more people will be experimented on in future and why that is bad. And we also talk about like why it is bad to force people to go into experimental treatment when they don't want to. So first of all, right, they tell you that, oh, it is bad that they have this, the reason why like there are still terminal illnesses that cannot be cured is because there's a shortage of people. But this isn't like particularly true, because like that increasingly there are more people who like have these terminal illnesses, like more people start to have cancer, and like because like they tend to live for like longer lifespan. So like you see like an increasing population of people with cancer, and among this increasing population, there are a lot of people who do want to like opt into experimental treatment because they hold on to the hope that this experimental treatment can help them to survive. So they do have this fear of death, and like they also want to survive because like their loved ones around them encourage them to opt into this experimental treatment. And like we think also that like there are other kinds of policies if you really need that extra people to experiment on, right? Like you can give incentives for people, you can give money to people to incentivize people to opt into like terminal illnesses, or you can just doctors can just be like more credible and like have real statistics to back up like the like chances, to try to increase like the chances of survival from the experimental treatment. So like they also meant, but then like they come up and then they said that, oh, poor people like without terminal illnesses are the ones who get forced into being experimented on in status quo. First of all, we tell you that's not true, because like a lot of like rich people as well, like in status quo do pay in fact to like try out for these these kind of experimental treatments. And like we think that like usually like doctors will also want to experiment on people who have that terminal illness, like for more accuracy, like to develop like better cures. So we don't think that what they said about like poor people without terminal illnesses being forced into experimentation is true. And we say that even if it is true, like there is some kind of benefit from that, because like those poor people are still like using that to feed their families, like to help to make ends meet. So there is some benefit that comes out from that. Yes.
In any applicative policy, would you apply experimental or new theories to solve problems that conventional theories haven't solved? Say behavioral econs or UBI to soften financial crisis.
Yeah.
So we think that okay, I think that your POI was like whether like we want to like if you want to like experiment instead of but I'm not very sure how that directly rebuts like my argument about the reasons like that there are people in the world to experiment on. So anyways, so I move on to my second argument about why it's bad for states to intervene and why like that hurts the principle of bodily autonomy. So like we think that it is wrong to use people as a means to an end, and like people are not the slave of state. Like in status quo right now, people get to choose whether to opt into experimental treatment or not. And like in status quo, like doctors try to convince people that this experimental treatment has a good outcome for them. So like the focus that doctors have is on those people, whereas like under government's policy, right, it's like the doctors don't focus so much on like the patients themselves, but rather than on like developing the cure. So what they are doing is not like their focus is not to like better the illness of the patient, but rather that like by doing this, like I am doing something that is greater good for the society. So like they are treating these people as a means, and so we think that there are limitations to the state, because like at some point like the state has to find the right balance between like doing what is good for society and like infringing on individual rights. So for example, an example of this is like when state like realizes that torture is not okay, because like it's still important to protect like these individual rights and to not like even if like that torture might lead to like some kind of good. So like the only instance where you might forcibly restrain people is like when people commit a crime and then like you imprison them. But then in this case, like that's different because like people aren't actually committing a crime. And like in the case of crime, right, like you have a choice whether to commit the crime or not. Like the state tells you, like if you commit a crime, I'm going to imprison you. But in this case, you are not giving people a choice because like people don't have a choice as to whether they have this illness or not. So like if they have that terminal illness, then they are immediately like subjected to like mandatory experimental treatment, and that's bad. So like why is it bad like to force people into like this to force people into experimental treatment, right? So like people tend to have this fear of experimental treatment, like, and also like when you force people into experimental treatment, you don't give them a choice to do other things that they want to do. So some people might want to spend like this very precious last moments of their lives with their family, like they want to spend time to like do everything that they haven't been doing. Like if they have been workaholics, they want to like explore the world, they want to do more of their life, they want to do charity, but like that doesn't happen at a point where like you subject them to like hospitalization so that like you can doctors can constantly monitor them and inject medicine into them. So yeah, so and some people also have like this intense fear of having things injected into them. Yes. So like we don't think that like that you should like subject people like and like infringe on their right to bodily autonomy by forcing like them to have things injected into them when they don't want to. And lastly, like it also establishes a precedent because like we think that if you think that experimental treatment can be mandatory because it is for the greater good, then like it's likely to set a precedent for like experimental treatment on people like with like less terminal illnesses. Very proud to this.
Speaker, I think that a lot of times the government makes decisions that they know for sure can benefit the larger part of society, and we think that this is one of it, and we think that it's highly important for government to impose this because of the fact that there's going to be a larger benefit occurring within this circumstance in the future. What am I going to talk about in my speech? I'll first talk about their point when they wanted to talk about the infringement of individual right, and also how they say that in their world it's also possible to get a lot of people to opt into these experimental treatments, and how that's not necessarily true. And then I'm going to talk about why it's more likely in our world we can get the larger benefit in the long run. But before that, rebuttals. They wanted to talk about how in their world it's also possible for a lot of people to want to opt into these experimental treatments, right? Why do we say this is not true? We say that first, we think that experimental treatments are oftentimes stigmatized because of the fact that it's uncertain. So we think that people, most often than not, are scared of uncertainties, right? They would rather just stay in bed and see their life away as opposed to taking part into experimental treatments that are uncertain. We think that this means that it's less likely for people in their world to opt into experimental treatments. But secondly, we think that when we make it mandatory, we think that now when people can't opt out, we think that hospitals have a larger incentive to have efforts in showing the moral good of doing these things, because obviously people would feel a bit agitated. People would feel like their right is being taken away. That means the hospitals would have more incentive to show the moral good of participating in the experimental treatment. This means in the long run, it's able to change perception of people towards experimental treatments. No, thank you. But secondly, they want to talk about how there's an infringement of individual right happening. We think that when it comes to terminally terminally ill people, there's a little to no survival probability, right? We think that in both circumstances, people die. But at the very least, we think that them dying in our world results to a better chance of other people surviving that particular illness or other illnesses in that matter. We think that if, for instance, if the illness is inherent, that their bloodline will get that particular illness sometime in the future, we think it's better that they go through the experimental treatment, because then we're able to produce some sort of deterrent medicine or something to deter their bloodline getting this illness. Moving on to my points. Why do we think that we get the larger benefit in the long run? So we think that when it comes to these experimental treatments, when there's a high number of people becoming subjects of these experiments, we think that the experiments will also increase in quality. How? Because now that it's a policy, we think that there's an added incentive for people to not take it for granted, and for hospitals to not want to screw up, because this is something that is already mandatory. This is something that is in the public eye. This is something that it's an information of the hospital that people can can leverage upon, right? So we think that in our world, there's a higher likely for these researchers and these hospitals to be held accountable. To be held accountable. That means there are more. That means that there's going to be more people being involved in ensuring the process of these treatments aren't problematic and are being done in the best interest of the larger part of society, as opposed to like pharmaceutical companies in status quo would not share the details of their research because of competition, and we think that that's because they're capitalistic, and we think that in our we're able to hinder that particular problem. Before I move on, anything?
OG kind of misses out on the micro comparative. If the government cannot guarantee that my terminal illness will be cured, why do I have to be the guarantee for people in the future that their terminal illnesses will be cured?
So we think that this debate is not a comparative of which side has a better world, right? And which side, So we think that in our world, there is a probability of that terminal illness to, for instance, have a longer lifespan, right? So in our world, there's a probability of them improving in terms of their health, but there's also a probability of them dying. But in their world, the probability only depends only them dying, as opposed to like improving or whatsoever. So we think that we still benefit from that. But secondly, right, why? So we think that we get the larger benefit in the long run because experimental treatments always usually takes a long time, because it's often halted by a low number of participation. We think that with the higher intensity of experiments that can be done with higher variables, we think that this enables the effect to be of a larger scale, right? We think that this means that it's able to benefit more people in the future. It's because of the large variables that exist, because you are able to have more people participating. This means that there are differing variables, and it can be applied to different kinds of people and illnesses, right? We think that now deterring factors can be figured out and tested way faster than status quo, right? And this means that not only you have the possibility of curing people with terminal illness, but also come up with treatments that prevent terminality. We think that's highly important, because without a lot of people participating, we don't think that goal can be achieved anytime soon. We think that now the process of experimenting treatments for people who need these treatments are very slow, and we think that we think that there are more people dying because of the fact that there are not many experiments being made to find the cure. With that, I'm proud to.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Divya, for the speech. Now for dialogue.
Yeah.
Should I start? Mr. Speaker, the problem with opening government was that their case was an incredibly aphilosophical one. There was no mentioning of how the state ought to balance the rights of individual people versus the greater good of society, right? This was just assumed that individual people can be used anyhow, as long as that benefits society and people in the future in some way possible. We just don't think that's true. And from my speech, you're going to get a comprehensive account of where the state actually draws that line, beyond which it should not use people as instruments for the greater good. I'll talk about a few things. First of all, I will talk about the state and the limitations on its powers. I will secondly talk about the solutions if this problem actually exists and why this is not such a need that cannot be mitigated in any other ways. First, before that, a couple of rebuttals, right? So first of all, this POI that was asked from one of the sides that, like the UBI thing, like should state ever experimentally do some policies, etc. Yes, it should, because at that point, the people have not told the government that, don't do anything. Right now, the economy is shitty. And our mandate to you is to not experiment with anything. We are happy living our lives the way that we are. No, the people have said, take us out of this shitty situation in any way possible. And at that point, the government has the mandate of people to do that. And also, it's not, subjugating individual human bodies to medical procedures. We think that's a very different case, right? If people do give the mandate to the government to, do the more conservative thing and not do much experimentation with radical economic philosophies, and yes, that is exactly what the government should do. It should respect the people's mandate. The second thing that I want to respond to is this idea that, now these kind of tests are going to be much better because hospitals won't screw up because there's some kind of I don't understand that logic. Here's what's happening, Mr. Speaker. Before, right now, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, etc., have an incentive to put forth a good image to attract people into their testings, right? They have to say that this is a clean process. Here are the number of tests that we have passed. Here are the number of FDA tests and procedures and checklists that we meet, etc., right? Because otherwise, people won't come forward for your test. But now you have given them absolutely no reason to do that because people have to come for your test no matter what. Pharmaceutical companies will make their money, right? No amount of public scrutiny is going to change anything because people are still mandated to come for your test no matter what. So I just don't understand that logic that says that these things will improve. If anything, they will get far worse. I'll talk about my arguments now. So first of all, why should not, Mr. Speaker, the state treat people as instruments that it can use and subject to pain for the common good without their consent? And the simple answer is because the state does not have any basis for doing so, Mr. Speaker. I am a unique person with my individual consciousness, with my unique understanding of myself. And the state is a collective of individuals who form the rest of society. We don't understand why that collective of individuals can say that this person we will use wherever we want. We will use him as a tool for our great happiness, because I don't understand what gives the right, just because there happen to be more people, to use me and my individuality for their common good, right? So how does a society work, right? We think society operates on the basis of rights and duties. So the way that we collect taxes from people, or the way we subject certain duties to people, is because we believe that there's a delicate balance between the rights that we give people and the duties that we put on them. So for example, you give tax to the government and you get infrastructure, etc. as a return. You abide by certain laws and you get protection from crime, etc. You pay for something, that's what you get. But here's, Mr. Speaker, here's the thing to keep in mind. At no point disproportionate duties are placed on individual people to achieve things that are basic human rights. They might say that you're getting universal healthcare, right? I could say that the actual the correct burden to place on people for getting that is to pay money in the form of taxation, to contribute productively towards the government, for the rich people in that government to provide universal healthcare to the people, not for those people to give away their individuality and in those final moments not be able to spend time with their family, to not be able to live out the remaining hours of their lives with dignity. We think that's a disproportionate obligation to place upon people, right? Why? Because we think it violates something very important, the bodily autonomy of people. It involves forcing them, when they choose to not go through this procedure, forcing them, restraining them, injecting things in them which could do a lot of harm to them, right? We think that feeling of helplessness, of being dispensable, of being valueless, of being a pawn of the state is absolutely terrible, Mr. Speaker, right? When slavery existed, African-American women were tested on gynecological procedures, right? Because they thought that would better the science. We are protesting against that thing. We are protesting against people who are the heroes of that movement, because we think that was an absolutely morally abhorrent thing to do, even though we acknowledge that that may mean that medical science today has progress, because no one has the right to use individual people in that way, right? Even if slavery may have had some economic benefits, may have on balance benefited society, even if that were true, that wouldn't justify slavery. And we think that's exactly what's happening, where an individual person is becoming essentially a slave to the government in the final days of their lives. He's not given the right to decide what he wants to do for himself, right? We think that is morally equivalent to things like torture. That's morally equivalent to things like using rape as a tool of war, because you are essentially saying that individual rights don't matter. What matters is the common good. We think that's absolutely morally deplorable. And they might say, you know, torture is fine. Like, we are actually okay with these things. That would just mean that they are, like, morally have no standing in this debate. And that would just mean that they lose that debate. It's not some kind of a, like, concession that they make and are able to, like, debate with us equally. Okay. I think the second big reason why this policy ought not be passed is because this establishes a horrifying precedent, Mr. Speaker. Like, right now, we believe that the state does not have this right over people's bodies and to subject them to things that it wants them to do. And we think once that precedent gets broken, once that idea gets broken, the state has the ability to do all sorts of things, right? Because this using terminally ill people against their will is happening on a daily basis, right? And that thing becomes solidified in people's minds as the appropriate way for the state to act, right? So there are no more arguments against, like, restricting women to have abortion, because you could say that there is no independent right over for women for their bodies, right? There is no argument against torture, because you could say that, you know, like, we recognize that the individual rights do not matter when it comes to the common good. We think that precedent is the reason why this policy ought not be allowed. I want to finally talk about the solutions. Andrea told you, Mr. Speaker, that this policy is, it's not like there is no need, there's a big need for this policy and there's no way to solve that. First of all, yes, there is uncertainty about the medical procedure, but there is a lot more uncertainty about death, and people want to avoid that at all costs. People are horrified at the prospect of just ceasing to exist, right? So their worst case outcome is dying anyway, right? They'd rather take that test to solve that problem for the people who can bring themselves to do that, right? So we don't think there is a dearth of people to do that who care about their loved ones. What is going to happen on that side, Mr. Speaker, is that now pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, etc., have to care very less of making these procedures safe, etc., because right now they have to establish certain checks, etc., and track people. Now they don't, right? A very good example of this is animal testing. Once people, like, we enforce that you cannot use multiple animals for the same test over and over again. You can use only one animal. There has to be a certain limit. Then people made ways to do that, right? If there was no restriction that you could use animals however you wanted, then they would just not have implemented those measures, because they would have just wanted to save that money. We think ultimately this worsens those procedures. Very proud in this debate to oppose. Thank you.
Members of the floor, we think that this debate lacks context. The welfare state that assumed this motion that gives freely accessible healthcare is based on burdening the future generation through things such as bonds or through other derivative instruments, right? We think that a majority of the healthcare system is financed by money that you borrow from the future generations that they have to pay at the end. We look at countries such as Sweden, for instance, such as Norway, maybe even Singapore, they have public healthcare systems that are robust, that borrow this money to create infrastructures and so on. We think, therefore, this is an important extension coming from closing government, because it answers the question to why do you owe future generations by giving up your body when the future generations have protected you and have given you a whole lifetime of having free healthcare at the end of the day. We'll talk about a few things in this debate. Firstly, we will talk about how I have a reciprocal obligation to future generations. The second is an extension to why we think that even in their best, if we agree with everything that opposition has said to how horrible this treatment is and how dangerous it is, we think that at best it also stops people from pursuing lifestyle that leads you to have terminal illnesses. And we think that the majority of terminal illnesses are actually caused by those lifestyle. Before that, a few rebuttals that doesn't fit in, right? Firstly, on this like extension coming from Sharik, like about like slippery, like basically it's a slippery slope argument that once we do this, what happens is later like more horrible things will happen. I don't think so. I think what naturally happens in society is that when we decide on bodily autonomy or the rights that the state have, it happens on a case-to-case basis. Just because we allow governments to have things like in Singapore, military conscription, which is like literally giving your body to serve for the military, doesn't mean that it justifies all the other things that the government can do towards your body, right? We think that it happens on a case-to-case basis. We have debates about it all the time. So we have the abortion debate, even though we've given more other kinds of bodily autonomy rights to the government, we still have that debate because it's a different case altogether, different actors and so on. I don't think it's a slippery slope, and I think that the argument ends there. Okay, let's go to the first argument. Note that this argument like tackles like literally the challenge coming from OO. What is the obligation that you have towards the generations? I think what's important and what you have to note from OG that is good is they have already pointed out all of the benefits you get from this treatment. But the question is, what is like why do you owe these people? We think one, what happens is to finance all of this like heavily accessible healthcare, what happens is the future generations usually have to pay for this, right? Governments issue bonds, for instance, to give enormous amounts of subsidies to build infrastructures, hospitals, and so on. Governments also take up resources that could have been used to create infrastructures, such as schools, for instance, that will benefit future generations in other kinds of ways. But government channel most of those resources into healthcare. What happens now? We think that the current generation of people now owes a reciprocal obligation to always benefit the future generation whatsoever to pay for the enormous amount of healthcare and subsidies that they get throughout their lifetime, right? And we think that still happens currently when you are healthy, when you have a working body and you pay taxes. But in the situation that these people have terminal illness and are unable to do so, we think you still owe that obligation towards the future generation. Why? Because the future generation, while paying for you, have enormous amounts of harms. When you have enormous amounts of bonds, for instance, like 100%, like governments like Malaysia, for instance, or the United States of America, the future generation can possibly live in poverty, for instance, right? They have certain rights to make more money, for instance. You have the probability of a nation going bankrupt like Greece. All of this probability and harms will happen in future generation. The only way for us to write this, the only way for us to make it an okay thing to do is to give a reciprocal obligation towards this future generation. That happens when you solve more diseases, when you have all of these benefits that can help them in that way. Before I move on, closing.
The poor are more exposed to terminal illnesses. The only stress relief they have is smoking. Gentrification means that you live in more polluted areas. Why do they owe an obligation to the people of the future when the state right now has failed them and they have to pay the price of their life?
So you see, right? They missed the whole OG argument about how this is to everybody with terminal illnesses. Like the very basis assumption of that POI is that it's the poor. It's not just the poor, it's everybody who have terminal illnesses. It can be the rich, it can be everybody, right? We think what happens is all these people will get it. I don't think that's the logic there is missing. But let's go to the second argument about why it stops people from pursuing horrible lifestyles. I think the whole chunk is that we would agree that what happens is like a lot of the terminal illnesses are unsolved, and therefore that's something that we should solve. So we think what happens is we would contest and we would say that most terminal illness actually comes and stems from lifestyles that are dangerous or unhealthy. Because the motion says terminal illness, it doesn't have to be a niche illness, like a very niche form of cancer, but we think those things can include as well. But we don't think necessarily. We think that a lot of terminal illness, such as like lung cancer, for instance, that we still doesn't have the cure to, or like things like when your muscles, for instance, stops functioning because you engage in things like boxing and so on, stems from having really horrible lifestyle. So we think what happens is when the when the LO says things like people have the fear of intense fear of being injected, what happens is that would happen to a lot of people. Now, the problem here is why people still pursue things like smoking or horrible lifestyle is because they know the moment that they have a terminal illness, the way they die is on a deathbed, being injected by morphine to ease the pain, and all this financed by future generations, and they feel this is a very comfortable way of dying. So it's not really horrible. But if they want to argue that it is horrible, we think that it's good because at least now people at least fear and do not want to go into those lifestyles at the end of the day, right? We think there's less lifestyles, there's less of this lifestyle, and there's a few benefits for this. One, I feel like what happens is generally a lot of people becomes more productive and become better members of society in that way. But we think what happens is secondly, there's just less expenditure on expensive treatments that you have towards people when they have these kinds of lifestyle. I think that's entirely horrible. Lastly, we will talk about why we think that closing government edged over the teams in this debate. I think the first thing is the way we edged over opening government was because that there was a missing link to why necessarily it's true that all these benefits exist, but why do you owe these benefits to future generations or towards the state at the end? I think that once you want to buy that argument, you have to buy our logic that fills in to that blank. But secondly, I feel that what happens is the way we edge over the opening half discussion is because we think that the discussion about choice is at the end a deadlock, right? It's true that opening government says that it's most of the time when you don't have this, the poor would be kind of coerced into a decision to have experimental treatment because they want to be paid. And it's true that closing opening opposition says you'll be coerced by the state. So we don't think that the discussion about choice is at the end resolved in this debate. Therefore, the thing that was resolved is the obligation you have to future generation, and that's why closing government wins this debate. Thank you.
Before we embark on the discussion of whether or not these terminally ill individuals owe something to the future generation, we must first discuss whether or not it's justifiable for you to take away the consent of individuals that have terminal illness at the end of the day. Because we think this is something that was lacking from side government. Because we think they didn't argue or discuss about whether or not it's justifiable for the state to take away the consent of actual still living individuals in order for them to achieve all this sort of information or benefit that they want to give at the end of the day. And that's exactly how closing opposition will enter today's debate. We'll tell you whatever benefit that they achieve at the end of the day is something that's insurmountable to the amount of pain and suffering that people have to go through in order to achieve that. We will tell you we don't think that innovation or the ability to have more knowledge is something that must come at the expense of authoritative decisions by the state. Before I move on to arguments, a few points of rebuttals. Number one, they told you, okay, we can have well-regulated experiments. It's not something that's really harmful. And given that in the motion it says that, the health or insurance, it's something that's totally accessible to individuals. That means that these individuals are insured at the end of the day. But we don't think this necessarily would be the case, because number one, we question on whether or not when these individuals consented or when they wanted or when they are forced to make up their decision, to what extent are the harms that will be imposed upon them. Because we assume that given that there was no illustration coming from opening government or closing government to tell us what kind of experiments or what are the procedures that these individuals will go through, we have to assume the worst there. This means that there will be constant induction of spinal fluids or constantly taking the blood of individuals. We just cannot see why this is something that is surmountable to the benefit that they also want to give. But this also means that the state have whatever measure or have the ability to just do anything with that terminally ill individuals. We cannot see the limit of what the state will be able to do. Do you want something like what the Nazis did to Jews, or like the hospitals, or the amount of experiments that they did to the minority at the end of the day? Because that's exactly the thing that they are doing. But secondly, even if this is something that's exactly safe, but what's the net benefit then? Because we cannot see then the justification as to why you should force these individuals at the end of the day. Because if it is safe, then people won't fear to experiment with themselves with this kind of medication. We just cannot see the rational calculus of individuals as to why they would still evade that decision. That argument falls. But then they want to talk about, them dying is the benefit is that you have more knowledge or that you have more ability to get better medication for the future generation or for your bloodline in that case. We think that this benefit is speculative at best. Two reasons. Because we think, number one, we still don't know whether or not we actually have the cure. What if the actual chemicals that you need in order for you to make the cure is on another planet? This is a possibility that's still logical to this logical to accept. But number two, we might not even have the mental capacity to even create the actual medication, right? Because like the human brain is something still limited, and it's still like we are dependent on whether or not we have time in order for us to think about that experiment, and whether or not we want to continue with the experiment. We think the amount of time or the amount of mental capacity that individuals have does not include the ability to just does not include the ability to confirm that there would be a cure at the end of the day. That means the individuals are just making this out of faith, and that's not a decision that we want to support. No, thank you. But number three, they told you, oh, but at least we would have two probabilities instead of just death when this individual is terminally ill. But we think death is better than bondage. The moment you consider that these individuals, there's already a probability of these individuals dying, you need to justify why it's okay for them to die at the end of the day. And there were no illustration as to what is the percentage of the success rate at the end of the day. Then we would have to assume the worst. The individuals would die. A lot of individuals would die at the end of the day. And why is it still justifiable then? No, thank you. But then, closing government came up here and talked about, oh, we want to push individuals to become more healthy at the end of the day. But number one, my response would be, so what? Given that the case that you must defend is that the state are already providing free access towards medication, we just cannot see why you can't take this away from them in order for you to like coerce or push them in order to make more healthy decisions. We cannot see why it must exclusively be punishing them into a life of torture. But secondly, we can still have alternatives like campaigns or just like subliminal messages. These are the kind of things that are already working, even though it's slow. That's a world they would rather have. Before arguments, sure.
If your problem is that the outcomes are not definite, isn't that an argument against experiments generally and like an extension science?
Here.
Yeah, in principle, we are against that. I know what's the problem with that. Arguments. Should human evolution come at the expense of arbitrary authoritative decisions by the state? We think number one, we should understand the context of the terminally ill. We understood that coming from opening opposition, they talked about how individuals have the ability to determine for themselves, they have bodily autonomy. We will extend far more than that. We think that terminal illness is not something that's equivalent to a death wish. Number one, why? Because we think that oftentimes this is not something that's of their fault. It's oftentimes genetical, it's oftentimes biological, it's oftentimes things like they inherit it from their parents. These are things like ovarian cancer, breast cancer, or diabetes. These are all kind of things they didn't consent to at the end of the day. But even if these individuals were to take harmful decisions for themselves, even if they smoke, knowing that there are insurmountable of harms towards that decision, we must then take into account why did they still take that decision. Is it because of the amount of stress that they have to go through? Is it because of the fact that the state is failing them, and that's the only way for them to be able to feel happiness at the end of the day? That's something that they need to be able to defend against from. But then we also need to talk about the rational calculus of the terminally ill. Given that they don't have enough time, we should think about how do you want to spend that time at the end of the day, or the ability or the right for these individuals to spend the amount of time that they have left. We think this is something that's very important that was neglected by government as a whole as well. But then let's look at how would this experiment look like then. We think it takes time to be certain. We think that we have to go through the patients have to go through prolonged pain of being unknowing and uncertain of the possibilities of things that will happen to them. Or number two, it's something that's highly volatile. We are talking about things that we've never discovered before. We are injecting things or chemicals that have never been injected in a human body before. We don't know of the reactions for the internal organs. We do have this probability that we want to take as well. But what are the possible benefits that they wanted to take? They want to talk about knowledge and information. But the colonization was justified based on the fact that they want to distribute wealth, they want to distribute knowledge. We don't think this is something that is like worthy, given the fact that millions of individuals were turned into slaves, and millions of individuals have to suffer because of that justified thing. We rather live in a world where individuals don't have that cure if they can live until they want to.
I'm going to talk about two things in this debate. One, do people who are terminally ill owe the future generation? And two, does this motion prevent lifestyle that causes terminal illnesses? But before that, I'm just gonna make a quick work of CO. Their assumptions that this experiment will be super painful and have no benefit whatsoever in any way is false. Why? One, think about the companies who are trying to do these experimental treatments or the ministries of health. Probably these companies want other people who are ill in the future to try out these experimental treatments or do these treatments if it succeeds. So most likely it's not going to be made to be super painful and super uncomfortable to the individual ultimately, right? There will be mitigable things to do like anesthesia. But secondly, look, like most likely these experimental treatments, if it's done by health ministries, they want more people to be able to practice this in order for this thing to actually cause people to be healthier and not die of terminal illness. So it's not going to be closed off and super inaccessible like that. My second point would be that it's not going to be that ineffective, and the doctors who are going to apply this is not going to be super stupid. Like, they're not going to inject cyanide to your body. Most likely, they're going to inject stuff that they have experimented on multiple other occasions before they went to humans before. It's like going to hamsters, going to guinea pigs, going to rabbits, and checking out if it consistently have created a benefit for multiple of these animals. That also deals with the pain thing, right? They can also measure the pain of these animals that they did before. So most likely, it's going to have a potential for it to be something that is useful. But secondly, and lastly, for CO, their arguments are against experiments in general. This motion assumes that experiments will exist anyhow. This motion only discusses who should we target experiments to. People who freely wants to choose into it, or should we give it to people who are terminally ill? Arguing against experiments have no place in this debate, and that's why CO is out of this debate. So, moving on to the clashes. One, do people who are terminally ill owe it to the future generation? The only response that we get is by an introductory argument that opening opposition gave, which is, why are we punishing people who literally did nothing wrong but had terminal illness, right? I have two responses to this. One, the hands of these people who have terminal illnesses are not clean. A lot of them are guilty by their own account. Not only did they cause this by smoking or consuming too much sugar that creates diabetes, for example, that is unfixable, but B, they knowingly did this when the burden when they know that the burden would be hardworking taxpayers. Notice the context of the motion: a state in which healthcare is freely accessible, right? So most likely these people know that they are going to harm other people, given that their actions already harm themselves and that they need to be treated in the hospitals. But see, even if there is a government failure as opposing opposition assuming it's a democratic country, right? There's a choice that these people already participated to. So, for example, if the government didn't regulate them for smoking, or didn't regulate that didn't regulate the choices of eating a Big Mac every day, right? That means the government also chose to not regulate that because the people did not choose to regulate that. It's their choice to, at the end of the day. But even if it's not their burden, even if it's not their choice for them to be this sick, and this is engaging to CO here and answering the concern of consent and why it's okay for the government to take over, think about it. In the context of a welfare state, when health is freely provided by the government, most likely the existence of this person in itself is reliant on the state existing by giving them a stable, peaceful environment for them to be born into this country, an awesome healthcare system that their parents can't afford, individuals that their parents who are smart and financially stable enough to do this, all the instruments of the state in which it gives them the right to life, which is the most basic right that they receive, right? And that's why at the end of the day, these people owe it to the state to contribute back when they cannot contribute in other means such as tax paying, as what opening opposition say. But this also signifies the morally inconsistent part of all opposition teams' case, is that they want other policies and they want other types of conscriptions like national service, etc. But they don't want this specific thing just because it's somewhat harmful, right? I think it's very morally inconsistent that they think that there's things that can be given out, but there are other things that the states don't require of them. Given that these people who are terminally ill most likely don't have anything to give anymore, this is the sole thing that they can give for the life they have been given by the state. Before I move on, opening.
Just to clarify the scope of your arguments, in instances where bonds are not involved and the free healthcare only exists because you collect a lot of taxes from rich people, do these obligations still exist, and what's the basis of those obligations towards future generations?
But it's not rich people. This is not a vacuum argument, because there's a context of a state that gives free access to healthcare. So this debate cannot be seen devoid of the context, right? So that POI doesn't stand. So let's move on to the second and most important point. Does this prevent lifestyle that cause terminal illnesses? And this is the core and crux of the debate, right? This is the most important thing. Nopal gives you substantial arguments on why the fear helps them to overcome their justification of using that drug or using that certain lifestyle that is very, very harmful. It's 6 minutes. Because if we don't have this incentive, most likely they can justify and say, oh, I can die peacefully and cry through the night. But given this, repeating from what opening opposition said, it gives a significant amount of pain that is a disincentive. CO's response to this is that it's their only form of happiness, that they do these things because they don't have financial opportunities, etc., etc. Look, this is an impossible argument for them to prove, right? Because there's a multitude amount of choices for different multitude amount of people, right? There may be ways out that we cannot judge right now, but we shouldn't just absolve these people of their own doings just because we can't see the other choices and we cannot judge each individual people, right? They have the potential. It's just that they haven't explored that other alternative. If they're so stressed, why they don't just make a circle with their friends, right? And have an AA meeting every time to make sure that they can share their stresses. My point is, at the end of the day, these people made a choice that knowingly burdens the state and knowingly harm themselves. And that is a choice that is enough for us to burden them, to give something back to the community that has taken care of them and given them the chance to life. I'm very proud to propose.
The son of the Gulf sounds like toxic parenting, or basically Asian parenting. I gave birth to you, I own you, you are at my absolute behest. But the debate clearly is about forcing individuals at the point in which you say that their life should come at the cost of what it is before. We draw the line at life. I think OO kind of positively shows you that there is a certain line in which there's balance at the point in which we pay tax that's commensurate even if we were to smoke. But if you were to notice the nuance of closing government's debate, they kind of somehow make this debate only about individuals who smoke and contributed to terminal illness, therefore they gave away that right. Here's why that's not true. Zazwan's speech told you that exactly the point in which no person can be liable for terminal illnesses that happen upon them due to biological reasons, then we shouldn't draw the line over there. But even if it was about smokers, we can also say to a large extent that smoking doesn't causationally, like directly cause cancer, because there are some people out here who do not die like peacefully because they smoke and get lung cancer, and some people out there don't smoke but end up with cancer anyway at the end of the day. So not being able to prove causation actually is a large premise that closing government wanted to tackle, but also with a small benefit that they could show to us at the end. Because we show you a couple things also at the same time. That shows you that rich people can also be individuals who can get the kind of cancer, for example. But regardless of that, in most circumstances, they are going to be poor. These are people who were either screwed over by the state because of things like gentrification, for example, or didn't have any other means of alleviating their lives except to smoke, for example, that will be at the behest of what we think should be the trade-off that we make for you. Then the closing government has to answer this question. Why, despite everything we've given to you, still doesn't warrant the ability for me to give up my life to these individuals at the end of the day? So this is the second issue in terms of response. Notice that in many circumstances, closing opposition told you that the way in which the future suffers doesn't have to come at the behest of the people in status quo. So a good example of this was back in Nazi Germany, even though there were experiments that were carried out towards the Jews that kind of maybe had some results, that wasn't an excuse for us to say that there had some been results there, therefore it is justifiable that we did all this suffering upon the people. We need to move away from government's large whole premise, which is we save X amount of lives, and that's more than how many lives that we put in suffering. Suffering is a metric that we have tried to prove to you, but something like flippantly they respond to at the end of the day. What do we tell you? We told you things like, firstly, when someone is diagnosed with terminal illness, more often than not, it changes the bell curve of how they kind of appreciate life. Movies like The Bucket List, or a lot of older people, drop a lot of insecurities, and their quality of life, or at least how they tend to appreciate it, significantly increases at the point in which they have terminal illnesses. But the ability for them to also shift their perspective about what life is has changed at a particular point of time. But what they're doing at this particular point is, because an old person might find out that they're diagnosed, I feel like there are insecurities that I can drop and live my life. You are directly disallowing that person from having the access to live that happy life that they otherwise would not have at the point in which they have terminal illness. The reason as to why, this debate has been about individuals with terminal illnesses is because we have to be able to prove to you that this particular subset of people are able to enjoy life at the point in which there's no utilitarian benefit behind them at all. In fact, as a good response, if you were to notice what government said as a whole, there's no utility in your life, therefore we can subject you to this test, then what about people who are depressed or unemployed or don't work, for example? They don't have any utility. Why do you still give them social welfare? So you have to show us why it is a direct death wish when you have terminal illnesses, and utilitarianism is not the correct metric for you to use in the debate as a direct response to that. So if you can't show us why this subset of people deserve that death wish, then you would lose, because your metric is only about how much more money can they make at this point of time. But as an added response, I'll tell you also why there is still a utilitarian benefit that people have at the point in which they do have terminal illnesses. For example, if a person finds out that they have terminal illnesses, they might drop everything that they have when it comes to inheritance, maybe donate it because they feel like there's only other ways in which you can explore things like altruism at the point in which you think that there's more for you to give away. But this is just a response. Still, this proves the fact that there is no utilitarianism at the point in which someone finds out that they might be dying. In fact, some people might just drop their job, pick up a job, at least help volunteer experience, because they know that there's still things that they can give towards society. On your side of the house, you don't do this at the end. No, thank you. Second issue. Here's where we weigh up whether or not they can say that your life is something that you can commensurately give off because we give you free healthcare. Here's the reason as to why my first POI told you was very important. The POI was, if you cannot guarantee absolute healthcare to cure my terminal illness, why do I have to give you a guarantee that I will put my life at the behest of what these experiments can be? Here's the flippant response that came to them. It's very nice, it's kind of accountable. No, if it's such a bad thing to warrant terminal ill people to give their lives up, it has to be an experiment that you have to do at parts where it has to be dire, for example, right? No, thank you. Because if it was so harmless, just do it on the majority of people because you can force them and there won't be any harm. Also, if we follow your logic, why do we have to put terminally ill people at more pain than the rest? Because this then allows us to understand what government wants as a whole. That terminally ill people deserve less rights, but somehow they can be subject to more pain because even though you might know that you're dying, we can subject you to even more, to be subservient to what the government's rules can be at the particular point. Before I move on though, I'll take a PI.
So you can't argue that only in our world you will die because you have terminal illness and you will die too in your world. That can't be the comparative, right? So we think that the reason why you're going to die is because there's no normal treatment that can save you.
Okay, so there's no normal treatment that can save me. Here's why experimenting will still kill these people as a response. You come back very sick, you come back very tired from all the experiments that these people will do to you. Plus, all the time that you could have spent doing a bucket list, you were doing it in the clinic. Why do you have this right to take away the last few days of a person's life away from them, acknowledging that they do have an actual timeline to how many more days they know that they have to live? In fact, it can be arguable that if you were to save a baby and say this baby has so many more years to live, why do we have to kill off a person and hasten their death because we know that they have an X number of days to live that can be then arbitrarily short? In conclusion, it just brings to you the idea to understand that the debate is about commensurate as well as a metric that you can put to people as to how they can live their lives, as well as perspective there. If you want to run a debate about actual benefits, show us why these experiments won't be as hard. If they're so nice, then you won't get the results that you necessarily want. If you can't show us why we have an obligation to the future and why the obligation will likely turn into a tangible benefit, I think Gov loses out in this debate.
I don't know what to do.